The third grand debate that I told you when we were, more or less discussing this class at the very beginning is between the rational and the sociological approaches. And the rationalist and the sociological divide, or cleavage, let's say, is something that actually emerged in core IR theory sometime towards the end of the 1980s with a number of key people. Ashley, Duval, and most importantly, what I have assigned, which we didn't have time to go over, Alexander Wendt. And the constructivist paradigm basically challenges, to a certain extent, the realist vision that power and interests shape the world. And they basically argue that if you want to understand how interests are formed, you cannot take them as given, but you have to take a step back and look into the state identities. Specifically, the constructivist paradigm, for example, would tell you that threat perceptions, or what constitutes threats, would change with regards to the level of identification that states have among them. So when, for example, United Kingdom builds nuclear weapons, that doesn't necessarily threaten the United States because they basically share a similar identity. But when Iran builds nuclear weapons, it becomes a threat for the US, particularly because they are part of different identities. So the critical point in constructivism, which we didn't have much time to look into, is that identities matter and states as the key players in international politics is a faulty assumption of realism. We have to look into the sub-state actors that they have, for example, a similar point with the liberals. And we have to look into state interactions as building blocks of state identities. So you need to be aware of the fact that there is, a significant portion of the current IR literature that revolves around the constructivist theory. But as an important contribution to IR theory, we have it starting in the mid-1980s with an emphasis on even things such as we take for granted, even things that we take for granted, such as anarchy, is a construction by states, and if it's something that states build, then it could be very easily something that states can unbuild. Okay? So that also sets constructivism apart from realism and liberalism, who argue that anarchy is something given and there is nothing you can do about it but to manage it. Okay? So constructivist, let's say sociologicals, versus the rationalists, the realists, and the liberals don't also agree on the notion and the omnipresence of anarchy. So these are just a few words on constructivism. Now, back to our globalism. So what we were discussing last week, okay? The most important, when I talk about globalism, what is the level of analysis do you think this theory is using? What is the level of analysis? Remember our levels of analysis? Classical realism, for example. What level was it? State level. Okay. NeoRealism. NeoRealism. Waltz. What level is it? Systemic. Okay. Neoliberal institutionalism. What level is it? Keohane. If it's not individual, if it's not state, what is it? It's systemic. Why is it systemic? Where is Keohane's arguments and theories are systemic level? What is he, what did he teach us a couple of weeks ago? That the world is a large interdependent whole, and the ties, specifically the economic and political ties among them, makes cooperation more likely. Okay? So he looks into, well, I can understand why you guys are saying it's a state level, because Keohane gives you the cost-benefit calculations that states do, but the cost-benefit calculations that states do for their foreign policy is shaped by their by the position that they have in the interdependent world. So Keohane is system. Moravcik, liberal theory of IR. What is Moravcik? What level is he? He's a state level theorist. Okay? He looks into the domestic bargaining calculations within the states. Bruce Russett, what level is he? Democratic peace theory. State. Okay? Who else did I teach you? Organsky. Okay? Power transition theories. Theory of hegemonic stability. Robert Gilpin. What are they? What level are they? Theory of hegemonic stability, power transition, are they state? It's system, okay? They are system. Why? Because they look at the distribution of power at the systemic level as shaping interstate relations. Globalism is also a system level analysis, okay? Because for the globalist paradigm, and you can also use the word neo-Marxist if you want to, it's necessary to understand, as you see in your PowerPoint here, the global system within which basically states would interact with one another, but there is a key difference between the global logic and the realist logic, okay? Or let's say the neo-realist logic. The neo-realists also tell you that it's the international system and the distribution of power within that system that shapes. The neo-realists also tell you that the global context matters, okay? But the global context for neo-realists matter for which reason? What is it in the global context that neo-realists emphasize? Power, the distribution of power. So there is actually a great give and take between the global and the realist paradigm, okay? They are similar in the sense that, or neo-realists within the larger realist paradigm, they stress the fact that a state's foreign policy is shaped by the global context within which the state finds itself. Okay? What would be the key difference? If both emphasize, okay, if both theories or both paradigms, neo-realism and neo-Marxism / globalism, emphasize, okay, that a state's foreign policy, a state's interactions in the international system is shaped by the global context within which they find themselves. Okay? What would be the key difference between them? This is the similarity. How would they differ? What would be the different attributes that they might use to analyze that global context? So the neo-realists would emphasize the distribution of power among states mostly around the military capabilities. Okay? So, well, economic capabilities of course matter in realism as well, but it's the distribution of power, whether it's military or economic. In that sense, economic is a tool that is serving the building of military capabilities. It's the distribution of power that the global context within which states try to achieve their own interests, objectives, what have you. For the globalist paradigm, the global context main attribute, okay, that matters to shape states' interactions is where they're located in the international capitalist system, or where they're located in the overall factors of production, whether they're industrial or agriculture, whether they're a secondary product producer or a primary product producer, whether they have an asymmetrical relationship of economic dependence on the more developed industrialized world. Okay? So in terms of the globalist and the realist, there is actually similar ground, because both emphasize actually power. Okay? It's, both is an analysis of the power relations between states, and the realists emphasize the military aspects of that power and the larger distribution of power at the global level as shaping state behavior, and globalists emphasize the economic aspects. And there is actually a, similarity between globalism and liberalism. What would they be? What would the globalists and the liberals share? What is it that the liberals have told us sometime in the 70s that contest the realist vision? Alican has said, for the realists, states are the main actors. Okay? What they do matters the most in international politics. Liberals have shown us that states are not unitary actors, but sub-state actors also play an important role. Okay? the globalists share that assumption from, let's say, liberalism and pluralism, in the sense that both the globals and liberals look into the sub-state actors. But the sub-state actors that they look at would be different. What sub-state actors do you think the globalist paradigm would look at? Exactly. Exactly. So the globalists would look into the role of multinational corporations, specifically, the example I have given you on Thursday, something like what happened in Chile in 1973, is a critical element shaping both states' behavior, the Chilean behavior, but also the level of political development in that country as well. Now, an actor such as a multinational company in the realist paradigm has very limited role. Okay? It's neither part of the state structure, nor is it an attribute of the international system. So the globalists criticize the realists then by overlooking a number of key actors in international politics and by de-emphasizing the potential role that they might play. Liberals and globalists there are similar in the sense that they both stress different actors. So it's the second one that you see here. There is a greater variety of actors in globalism and pluralism. That's the name pluralism anyway, or /liberalism. So the type of factors that you would need to grasp, analyze in the globalist and the liberal paradigm are much higher. It's the emphasis on economic factors, okay, which is a second, let's say, common ground between the globalists and the liberals. For the realists, economics matter only to which degree? If you're a typical realist, how would you say economics, the GDP of a country, let's say, play a role, or the type of technological advances that a country has? For a realist, Deniz, exactly. Economics matter to the extent to which it contributes to the military / hard power of a country. Okay? Liberals have already contested this in 1975. Okay? We have seen this. The liberals have already argued that economics matter on its own, not only as a tool to serve military power. So the liberals have already contested in the mid-70s that the realist preoccupation with security as the main priority for states is too limited. Okay? So liberals have already told us sometime in late November that economics matter as much as political / security issues. But liberals put an equal value on it. Okay? If you think about, for example, let's say security interests and economic interests, these were the key interests of states anyway. If you think of that, for the realists, security interests trump them all. Okay? Security interests matter the most. Everything else is secondary. Okay? For the liberals, security and economics play an equal role among themselves. So economics matter as much as security, military, political interests. Now, by the time you come to globalists, they say, no, economic matters the most. Okay? So in terms of prioritization of interests, realists tells you security interests are the most important. Liberals tell you security and economic interests play an equally important role, that they are equal in terms of their value for a state. Globalists tell you, well, no, everything is predetermined by economics to start with. Why? Why do the globalists say that? Why do a typical globalist will tell you that economics trumps them all? And if you don't have economic power, if you don't look into economic interactions, everything else is meaningless. Why do they say this? Where do they get the idea from? Karl Marx. Okay, this is the Marxist ideology, or the Marxist, basically theory. So economics matter the most. So if you look at these three paradigms, realism, liberalism, and globalism, you actually see over time the increase in the relative importance of economic interests, where liberals see an equal value with security concerns. And when you come to the globalists, economics trumps them all. And both the globalists and the liberals emphasize the transnational character of international politics. And once you talk about transnational character, it's not necessarily only the systemic determinants that plays an important role, but the social and economic groups that cross-cut boundaries become important actors. We already know that. Now, in terms of, and these are the things we have already discussed last week, in terms of the basic contributions of globalism, okay? This is where we left off on Thursday. Remember, we talked about how three basic ties, according to globalists, continue to basically perpetuate the ties of dependence between the North and South. Okay? What were these ties? Do you remember? And one more. Foreign direct investment. Okay? Three ties. Trade, foreign aid, and foreign aid and foreign direct investment. Okay? So trade is a tool, according to globalists, continues the exploitation of the South by the North. Okay? And they basically argue that the main institutions that are created for liberalizing trade, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, first and foremost, and the WTO, what we have right now, these form the rules of free trade, basically. Okay? They basically set the region, they basically set the institutional framework within which all states have to basically follow in order to trade with one another. Now, the globalists argue that, and this is also similar to the realist paradigm, the more powerful states, who are they? They are the industrialized market economies of the North. The more powerful states, and power from a globalist perspective, more economically powerful states, whereas for the realists, more militarily powerful states, but nonetheless, more powerful states, according to globalism, use trade as a tool to continue the exploitation of the South. Now, why is trade a tool of exploitation? Do you remember? Why?
Because industrialized countries sell some valuable things, whereas they buy just agricultural products.
Okay, it lies in the very nature of the product that countries produce. Okay, so it's not necessarily what the industrialized countries sell to the less developed countries, but the very nature of the product, which, as I have actually explained on Thursday, primary products are always substitutable. Okay, with one exception. What is that exception? Oil. Okay, oil is the only exception to the primary products which is not substitutable. Okay, so only the oil-producing countries, which is OPEC, oil-producing and exporting countries, could break the vicious cycle, according to globalists. The rest find themselves in a less powerful situation, not because necessarily everybody wants to exploit them, but because of the very nature of the product within which they specialize. Okay? So as long as you are a primary product producer, okay, as long as you depend, as Ali Can have said, on agriculture production, okay, if you are, for example, Colombia, who depend on coffee production, or if you are Ghana, who depend on, let's say, rice production, if you are, I don't know, Zambia, who depend on peanuts, one of them has peanuts predominantly, that means, okay, your overall income is subject to the fluctuations in demand in the global economy, and at the same time fluctuations to the primary product supply. Okay? There were times, for example, when there were natural disasters in Colombia and the whole of coffee production was stalled. Okay? Which meant that you cannot control natural disasters. Okay? If you are completely dependent for your welfare on one type of a primary product, you are subject to the whims of nature, you are subject to fluctuations in demand, and it's the nature of the product itself. Primary products in and of itself becomes problematic in capturing these countries in a box of exploitation. Okay? Now, how would the liberals respond to that? If you are a liberal, let's assume I bring here Keohane and Andre Gunder Frank from neo-Marxism, okay, who's a Latin American neo-Marxist writer in the 70s. Okay, so Keohane and Gunder Frank are sitting here, and they're talking about international trade. Okay, they're talking about, let's say, in the 1980s, 1990s, the same format. Okay, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, okay, Colombia, they are trading with United States, Western Europe. Okay? They predominantly sell them, at those years anyway, primary products, and they buy back, let's say, German machinery, American technology, what have you. Okay? What would Keohane tell Andre Gunnar Frank, a neoliberal institutionalist? Okay? What do you think? Or it could be Kreisner as well. Keohane, Kreisner. What would be their arguments? What would they say? They say, for example, United States has a trade agreement with Mexico. Okay? Liberalized trade. Mexico, well, in the 1980s, it has changed a little now, has predominant agricultural products that it sells to the Americans, and they buy machinery from Americans. If you're Keohane, what kind of an interaction would that be? Exactly. It would be a mutually beneficial arrangement. Okay? That from a liberal perspective, okay, when states engage in economic interactions, as Tolga have said, okay, when they trade with one another, it's actually mutually beneficial for all. Okay? So Mexico benefits, United States benefits. Why? Okay? They're able to sell their products to one another. They're able to use their interactions in an economically advantageous way. And the more they find themselves tied with economic ties, interaction ties, what have you, in multiple networks, global governance institutions, the less likely that when a conflict arises among them, that conflict could lead to a military confrontation. Okay? This is the very essence of neoliberal institutionalism. The more interactive ties, the more interdependent the world is. And interdependence comes through trades, institutions, financial framework, nuclear non-proliferation regime, all the regimes we talked about. The more ties you have among states, the more cooperation becomes more likely, and the less likely a conflict among them, Mexico and US, find themselves. So trade, according to liberals, okay, they would see this as a tie that would establish a bridge between the North and South, the more developed and the less developed countries, but the trade ties would be such that it would benefit them all. Okay? So if you're a country that would prefer to be isolated from the rest of the world, that is actually a disastrous situation according to liberals. Now, globals look at the very same thing. Okay? US-Mexico trades. The globals don't see a mutually beneficial outcome, just the opposite. They stress the fact that due to the very nature of specialization between US and Mexico, trade ties between US and Mexico benefits the US relatively more. Okay? Why? Because of the very nature of the products that US is exporting to Mexico. So trade, according to globals, is not something necessarily advantageous, but it's basically a tool of exploitation. Okay? So in terms of the ties of development, okay, the liberals would emphasize these ties that you see here benefit all participants. Okay? It benefits the North, it benefits the South. Globalists argue, no, it doesn't benefit the South. Okay? It benefits the North in a predominantly unequal fashion, and as long as the rules, the regimes, the structures which are put together by the northern developed countries, çok yaşa, in the post-World War II period remain in place, they continue the exploitation of the South. So southern states, what do they want? They want to change the rules of the game. Okay? Where do they voice these demands? The attempts to change the rules of the game, where do they voice these attempts? The UN. Okay? So we talked about UNCTAD, okay? The creation of UNCTAD in 1964, the community subsidy agreements in the 1970s, and the rounds of trade negotiations, the Kennedy round, the Tokyo round, the Uruguay round, all of them, and then now recently you have the Doha round, all of them are about changing the rules of international economic interactions. Trade is one of them, so that it would be, from a globalist perspective, more equal, okay, and less exploitative for the less developed countries. Yes, Alican.
If we
Mm-hmm.
of norms to serve. And what happens if the less developed country is not located in the capitalist system? Because this happens in the
Yeah.
capitalist system.
Yeah,
You
that's
have
a very
to
good.
push them to create some ties between you and him or her. So you have to use some power, I think, in order to make them.
That's a very good question. There are two possible things that you can raise here. Okay. Now, let's just talk about it for a second. Trade, aid, and investment. Okay. All three, from a globalist perspective, are tools of exploitation. All three, from a liberal perspective, are tools of interdependency. Okay. So they see the very same tools in a different fashion. Now, the question you can ask this: what if? Okay, how would you falsify or how would you object to globalist paradigm? In two different ways. One, what if there are countries that use the very ties that globalists label as exploitative to develop? Okay, so what if you have countries, okay, that used international trade to get out of the exploitation cycle? Okay, countries such as Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, okay, Japan in the 60s. They all used the international trade mechanism, okay, to break the cycles of underdevelopment and to become, the most rapidly growing economies in the world. And currently, again, we are looking at a similar group of states: China, India, Brazil, Argentina, that do the very same thing, that they use both international trade and foreign direct investment to break the cycles of exploitation. So one possibility is this: if you can find cases, okay, such as South Korea or China, that have used the very same ties that globalists argue to be tools of their exploitation to break the ties of dependency, you have a serious problem with regards to globalist paradigm. So there are no countries, more or less, that could actually stand on its own without being, interactive with other countries. But his question also implies another component. What if a country wants to remain completely detached from the outside? Okay? Would other countries force it to open? That's his question. Okay? What is the answer? Could you have a forceful opening of a country who wants to remain completely detached to the outside world? Of course, you can have, forceful openings have occurred over centuries. We talk about China on Thursday, okay? That was by force. It was done by force in 19th century. Japan, 1854. Until 1854, by the very nature of its geography, Japan was relatively isolated from the rest of the world. What happened in 1854? Well, the Europeans came to Japan, okay, and they forced Japan to open. So mid-19th century, Japan was forced to open by the European colonizers. So Ali Can's point is this: no country can remain closed as long as there are other countries that want something out of it, which in return brings power. Okay? And you cannot force another country open economically unless you also have military power. So military and economic power should, from a globalist perspective, go hand in hand. And the international capitalist system that we're talking about must have actually emerged over time through some form of military exploitation as well. Okay? The answer is yes. Okay? And one of the best theories that actually looks into that is by Wallerstein, Immanuel Wallerstein, who is, still teaching at SUNY Binghamton. And he wrote in the 70s a couple of books that basically set the basis of the globalist paradigm. And he looks at the world as an international capitalist system that basically began to emerge sometime in the 16th century. Why do you think he would emphasize the 16th century? Late 15th, 16th century. Well, it's not colonization. This is the beginning of the age of discovery. Okay? Colonization will come later on. And the age of discovery, well, we don't call the age of discovery colonization. Colonization comes after the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. But you're right, it's a form of colonization because, Europeans, mainly from which countries? 16th century. Which countries? Spain and Portugal go to, they set out on their route to India and they discover the Americas in between. And they basically transfer wealth from Americas to Europe. So the age of discovery leads to a capital accumulation, something you probably learned in your SPS 101, 102 classes, which in return form the very basis of capitalist revolution to come later on. So age of mercantilism in the 16th century is the basic tool for capital accumulation that countries use later on. Now, Wallerstein argues that in the 16th century, we began to see the emergence of a new type of an international economic system which has trade at its very core. And Wallerstein says basically the world could actually be seen as a large whole where every country has a specific place, okay? So the world economic system within which you guys are living in emerged in the 16th century. Its defining element is capitalist, okay? So the globalist stress is not necessarily on anarchy, but it's on the capitalist attribute of the international system. And the whole economic system operates basically through a division of labor. So what Marx was talking about is a division of labor between the bourgeois and proletariat in a capitalist system, UK or Germany, is something that takes place at the global level according to theorists such as Wallerstein. So they argue that we have, we can divide the world into different categories of states, okay, that could have a label associated with them based on the relative position that they have in the international economy. This is again similar to realism in the sense that, remember how we classified states in the international distribution of power exactly from a neo-realist perspective. We talked about superpowers, we talked about great powers, we talked about middle powers, we talk about weak states, okay? Now, what enables us to classify states into these, let's say, relatively small cubicles in neo-realism is the relative power that they have at their disposal, mainly measured through their military capabilities, okay? Now, globalists do the very same thing, okay? They classify states into a number of different cubicles, okay? But instead of using military capabilities as a tool to differentiate between them, a globalist such as Wallerstein would actually use the economic tools, economic capabilities of these countries, and specifically the type of production that they specialize in to classify them. So Wallerstein says that you have 3 different types of states, or you can actually put states into 3 different types of categories: core, the semi-periphery, and the periphery. And the core is the industrialized market economies of the North. The periphery is the less developed states, and the semi-periphery, okay, could be either a peripheral state on its rise towards the core, or it could be a core that have, lost its main tool and dropped and found itself in the semi-periphery. These are not static categories, okay? Change is constant within them. So depending on the type of production that matters at any given period of time, a country could find itself in the core or in the semi or the peripheral position, okay? In the 16th century, for example, Wallerstein tells you that naval power, the capacity of states to have, extensive navies and, go all the way to different parts of the world, shaped their ability to be in the core. So Spain and Portugal in the 16th century were the core countries, okay? They were the explorers and the exploiters, okay? But by the time you come to the 19th century, okay, the definition of the core began to change. It's no longer the age of discovery, but it's the type of industrial production that countries have. Since Spain and Portugal didn't enter the Industrial Revolution game, while they were in the core in the 16th century, they found themselves slowly dropping to the semi-periphery and then down to the periphery by the time you come to the 19th century. Similarly, okay, it's possible to talk about, for example, the current global transformation, where China, which was the periphery in the 19th century, which became more or less the semi-periphery sometime in the 70s, is now part of the core in 2012. Okay? Because the type of production and the type of level of development that China had enabled it to rise up. Okay? Similarly, okay, Spain and Portugal are now not even in the semi-periphery, they're still in the semi-periphery, but they might find themselves, like Greece, for example, slowly descending down to the periphery. So what do these categories mean? Okay? Wallerstein tells us that depending on the type of economic capabilities, type of aid production that a country has, it will be placed in a specific position. Okay? That position in return shapes its foreign policy. Okay? So this is also where globalists and realists share common ground. Okay? Because realists tell you that where a state is located in the national distribution of power will determine its foreign policy. So if you are a weak state, your foreign policy will be dictated by the great powers. Okay? In the same fashion, the globalists tell you that if you are in the periphery, okay, your foreign policy will also be shaped by what the core wants you to do. Okay? In both of them, in contrast to liberalism, the element of choice is non-existent. Okay? So when a peripheral country or when a weak state, either the globalist terminology or the realist terminology, chooses to enter, and this is not even military force, Alican, chooses to enter an international organization such as WTO. Okay? Both the realists and the globalists tell you, bless you, it's not a voluntary choice. They have to do it. Okay? Whereas a liberal will tell you, no, it's by voluntary choice. Okay? They choose this because it's a mutually beneficial situation or a mutually beneficial, has a mutually beneficial outcome for these countries as well. So liberals emphasize the element of choice for states where states freely enter and then exit, of course, international arrangements. How could the core, from a global perspective, exploit the periphery? Okay? Because if the whole of the periphery is constantly exploited, the situation would be unstable. What Marx would have predicted for capitalism to take place, with the proletariat overthrowing the bourgeoisie, you might have a world revolution. Okay? The peripheral states might combine their forces and overthrow the core. Okay? Why do you think it doesn't happen? If this is indeed the international economic situation as the globalists talk about, why doesn't the periphery come and basically organize their forces, overthrow the core? Or a related question would that, does nobody in the periphery benefit? What do you think? These are the cycles that I talked about. Who do you think benefits in the periphery? If you're a globalist, what would you stress? You would stress the fact that in both the semi and the periphery, there would be a class of people that directly benefits from the world capitalist system. Okay? So globalists argue that there is actually what we can call an international capitalist class. Okay? So there is within the periphery a group of people, of course much smaller in numbers, who benefit from the exploitation of their country. Okay? Some globalists call them the comprador class. Some globalists call them the rent-seeking state. Okay? You probably heard of the rentier state. And some globalists talk about, a small group of capitalists. In most of these countries, there is in the periphery. Africa now is a perfect illustration. The small cadre of people that directly benefit from the international economic system also hold on to, again tied to Ali Can's question, also hold on to the ties of power. Okay, so for the globalist paradigm, okay, there is actually a very basic definition or a very basic explanatory explanation for the rise of right-wing totalitarianism, or any wing, doesn't really have to be right-wing, but mostly right-wing, because they're also capitalists. There is a reason for the rise of dictatorships in Latin America, in Africa, and that's because the small group of people who benefit directly from the international world economic system in the peripheral countries continue, the exploitation of their own people by repressing them. Okay? So you see, for example, the rise of dictatorships in Africa, where a small group of people that form the state, okay, would exploit their own country, would be in a coalition with, let's say, the capitalist class in the northern states, and the ones who suffered the most would be the proletariat or the working classes or the general people in these countries. So rise of dictatorships, okay, in the less developed countries, according to globalists, is an outcome of these countries' position in the international economic system. Now, this is actually something should be very interesting for you. It was very interesting for me when I was your age, okay? When we talked about liberal paradigm, okay? One of the things we have already seen is the fact that the type of a political regime that a country has, whether it's a democracy or not, shapes its foreign policy behavior. No? So we have seen with Bruce Russell, for example, or James Fearon, or Mesquita, what have you, a democratic country is less likely to fight a war. Okay? And we call this second image. Okay? Now, within the globalist paradigm, you have something else. Okay? The type of an international position that a country has shapes now its internal politics. Okay? So in the liberal paradigm, under democratic peace, if you think of your X and Y, X being democracy and Y being peaceful resolution of conflicts, you're looking at a domestic level factor shaping foreign policy behavior. An internal level attribute shaping, influencing external behavior. That's what democratic peace told you. Something internally shapes your behavior externally. Okay? The globalists change this the other way around and tell you that something external, international economic system, shapes something internal, your political regime. Okay? So the globalists tell you that the international economic structure and the relative position that a country has in the international capitalist order also shapes the rise of a dictatorship in the less developed countries. Okay? So external factors, international capitalist order, shapes your internal attributes. Okay? Which means then, when you look into, for example, the rise of, and this is called second image reversed, by the way, if you look at the rise of dictatorships in the less developed countries, the source of political instability, dictatorship, civil wars, military takeovers in the less developed world, according to globalists, is not internally located. Okay? It's caused by the outside. And Allende example is a good illustration of that. Okay? So this is why, for example, globalists use a similar correlation like liberals, but to argue just the opposite. Okay? They talk about the second image, but their second image is reversed, where not internal attributes shape external outcomes. External outcomes or external attributes shape internal outcomes. Okay? So dictatorships in the less developed countries are not even caused internally according to globalists, but it's an outcome, it's a natural, inevitable outcome of these countries' position in the international capitalist system. So exploitation is not only economic, but it's so political. Okay? And in the same sense, the rise of dictatorships is necessary for exploitation to continue. Because if you have a democratically elected government, the next step would be some form of redistribution policies where not everybody would, not a very small group of people would benefit, but everybody should actually benefit from, let's say, whatever comes up. I'll just end this with one note. The tool that globalists, for example, use to assess these economic and political exploitation would be, for example, multinational companies, extraction industries specifically. So globalists argue that if you are an African country that has, copper mines, okay, the multinational company, British, American, Dutch, what have you, French, that comes to that place to extract that copper, okay, will not necessarily bring in technological know-how and what have you, but it will just extract the surplus and take it to the global markets. So in order for a country's wealth, because copper or whatever mine, gold, diamond, oil, all of them is wealth, in order for it to be extracted, you need to actually repress the people. Okay? The people to get hold of that. And in order to repress the people, you need the layer, you need some kind of a middleman. Who is your middleman? Yeah, exactly. The middleman, the intermediary, is a dictatorship. So you would repress the people through the intermediary, extract the resources, and take them to the global markets. And it will only benefit the capitalist classes in the more developed countries and the small rentier state or the dictatorship that an African country has. Now, but the important thing is, this goes into political development literature and comparative politics here, is the fact that you can actually take different offshoots from the globalist paradigm to assess the relative development that these countries have experienced over time. So, globalists and realists then have common ground here. Okay? The fact that they stress relative power, the fact that they stress the internationalist system within the larger IR framework and the impact of the absence of central authority on the individual states, more or less the same, but the tools with which they differentiate between different categories of states, the tools with which they think that the international system is created is different. One is political, the other is economic. I'll stress one more thing. When we talk about power transition theory, do you remember I talked about the rise and fall of great powers? Mearsheimer also told you that great powers don't necessarily remain constant. There is a change over time through the tools of powers of Spain and Portugal. Well, the same thing holds true in globalist paradigm. And instead of this power transition, power transition through military power, you can actually see a cyclical process of development in the globalist paradigm. Okay? What we call in economics Contradiev cycles. In every time period, there is economic expansion at the global level, which could be followed by economic contraction. Okay? Where do you think we are now in terms of global economy? Which part of the cycle do you think we are in 2012, 2013? Is the world economy expanding? Is the world economy contracting? It's contracting, okay? It's contracting because the main motors of economic growth have slowed down, and now you see new avenues of economic growth. Now, Contradiev cycles basically tell you that economic growth is not constant, but the locomotive, the engine of economic growth in one period to the other also changes, which in return explains why cores change. Okay? Who becomes a core depends upon the cyclical pattern of world economy. For you, what matters here is that this is similar as a concept to power transition theory and also to theory of hegemonic stability. Okay? Wherein hegemon rises and hegemon declines, a new hegemon rises again. Robert Gilpin and Kegley's theory of hegemonic stability is similar to the globalist logic of economic change through a cyclical pattern.